So President Trump tweets out today that he is very happy about the tax bill. Here is what he tweeted. So he tweeted, quote, "Stocks and the economy have a long way to go after the tax cut bill is totally understood and appreciated in scope and size. Immediate expensing will have a big impact. Biggest tax cuts and reform ever passed. Enjoy and create many beautiful jobs." You gotta love the guy with the beautiful jobs, all caps. This is the thing about Trump, and this is what's so puzzling to me about his presidency, is that President Trump's policies, as I say, have been largely conservative. And when I say largely, I mean almost entirely very conservative. And yet, he's really unpopular. And he is the president who, of all presidents, should best understand marketing, right? I mean, this guy is the marketing guru. He's the marketing guru of all time. He transformed what is, by any measure, a dicey real estate empire into television fame and fortune, and then that into the presidency. And yet he doesn't seem to know how to wed positive rhetoric and useful rhetoric to an agenda that has been very positive for Americans thus far. I mean, I was looking at a list of his accomplishments today, and the list is sizable. I mean, if you look at what they've done in the White House, it's not nothing. You know, it's not everything. It's not like they've done tons of stuff through Congress. They haven't. This has not been as productive a first year as, for example, Barack Obama's first year. But if you look at all the things that Trump has actually done, he's done some pretty good things. I mean, I made a list of these things this morning, and I've been trying. I mean, I know that folks who listen to the show know I've tried to be as fair to Trump as humanly possible. So here's just some of the stuff that Trump has done in year one. So Justice Gorsuch, obviously, big win for President Trump. The defeat of ISIS, we've talked about on the program. The media have basically ignored it. ISIS grew under President Obama, who called it the JV squad. ISIS has now reverted to being basically a nothing. Right? ISIS has basically been cut all the way down to size. I mean, in territorial terms, they've been reduced to virtually nothing. And he's done all of that without having to oust Bashar Assad. Maybe he should oust Bashar Assad, but that's a different issue, as many of us have been saying for a long time. And the stock market under President Trump has soared 5,000 points this year. You know, that I don't think that's always a great measure of a president. It soared under Barack Obama, too. But yeah, he does get credit. He's the one in the White House. There's been excellent growth, and the unemployment statistics are very strong under President Trump. I think that's largely due to the market understanding and knowing that Trump is not a threat to their business, that Trump is not somebody who's trying to threaten their business. He has cut regulations at a 22-to-1 ratio. For every new regulation added, 22 have been cut. Right, curbing the Iran deal, President Trump declared that Iran had been decertified under the deal, which paves the way for new sanctions. He should be pushing for further sanctions, but he's also been pushing for an anti-Iran alliance that has been extraordinarily powerful and has reshaped the region. A lot of that is the unintended result of President Obama's attempts to make Iran a regional power. But Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, they're now in a de facto alliance. He announced Jerusalem as Israel's capital, obviously. He's started to open public lands. The federal government has seized vast swaths of the West. Nearly all of Nevada is federal territory. A lot of that land ought to be returned to the people for their use. President Trump is moving along those lines. He passed new sanctions against North Korea. Now, listen, he hasn't solved the North Korean problem, but frankly, who could? I don't see a real solution there, and unless he knows something I don't, the best he's going to be able to do is pass those new sanctions, which he did. They're going to repeal the individual mandate, as I discussed. Tax reform, as I discussed, a record number of appellate court appointments. So he's nominated and approved 12 appellate court judges, which is more than any other president in history in his first year. He pulled out from the Paris Accords. The travel ban was finally approved by the courts. It was botched originally in pretty bad fashion, but it's now been approved by the Supreme Court. He's unshackled the military. He's changed the rules of engagement. He stopped ripping on the police, which is something that President Obama was very fond of, was ripping on the police at every available opportunity. So he's done a lot of very good things, right? And this is the problem for President Trump. In the good Trump, bad Trump construct, there's so much good. There really is. There's a lot of good. The question is, why can't it all be good? Why does there have to be bad Trump? Because when you look at the bad Trump list, most of the bad Trump list is about things that he's failed to do, picks that he's made in his administration, and stupid stuff that he said. Well, maybe if he didn't say stupid stuff and pick bad people for his administration, he would have been able to get more good stuff done. A disciplined President Trump is the best President Trump, okay? President Trump has been more disciplined over the last 3 weeks. He has. Look at his Twitter feed. It's been a lot less rabid than usual. We haven't gotten a lot of the random fights with LeVar Ball. We haven't gotten as much of the I'm ripping on the NFL now. You know, if you look at Trump's failures, they've largely been driven by his mouth. And if you look at Trump's successes, they've largely been driven by his administration. And if you would just let his administration do their job, I've been saying this literally since the beginning of his administration. He's picked some very good people to do their job. If he would just shut up and let them do their job, everything would be much better. So, you know, let's play the good Trump, bad Trump song, because this is an ultimate good Trump, bad Trump episode. Do we have that?
Good Trump, bad Trump, which one will we get today?
So as you know, I just named a bunch of good Trump, right? And Trump is pumped about the tax bill. All of that is very good. All of the things that Trump is a problem about are things that do make a difference as president. Now, I know the tendency for conservatives is to just say, okay, the president says what the president says, and who cares? Just ignore it and be grateful for what you got. But the problem is that if you look back at the Obama administration, I was there. Okay, the most damaging things that President Obama did were not on policy. They were tearing Americans apart from one another. They were destroying American unity through the use of his rhetoric, through the promulgation of his worldview. That's the stuff that presidents are really remembered for, right? You remember a president for maybe 2 legislative accomplishments, maybe. Right? What do you remember Ronald Reagan for? You remember Ronald Reagan for tax cuts, basically, and taking down the Soviet Union. That's it, right? That's all that we remember about Ronald Reagan. Bill Clinton, what do you remember him for? You really remember him for the tax increases, and then the tax decreases, and then the impeachment, right? That's pretty much what you remember Bill Clinton for. And maybe his crime bill. You remember George W. Bush for his tax cuts and the war in Iraq, right? Those are basically the things that you remember George W. Bush for. But what you remember about each of these presidents is how they changed the American culture in deep and abiding ways. Right? That's how you remember the presidents. What you really remember about Clinton is not his legislative accomplishments. What you remember about Bill Clinton is that he was somebody who totally disconnected honor from the office of the presidency. What you remember about Ronald Reagan was the morning in American optimism of the Reagan administration. What you remember about Nixon was Watergate and the idea that the presidency was corrupt. What you remember about Jimmy Carter was generalized feelings of incompetence in the presidency, which led to the rise of Reagan. What you remember about George W. Bush was the notion of an honorable guy who didn't know how to defend himself if you're a Republican, and a liar and a cheat if you're a Democrat. If you remember Barack Obama, what you see as a Democrat is a guy who finally made America come to terms with racial conflagration. And if you're on the right, what you see about Barack Obama is a man who deliberately used race as a polarizing issue in America, tearing American from American, fighting class and race war, and making intersectionality a chief plank in the Democratic platform. Right? That's what we remember. So when we say about Trump, look at all the great things he's doing, ignore his rhetoric. You can't ignore what the president says. What the president says has a major impact. So we've talked about all the good Trump, now for a little bit of bad Trump, okay? So here's a perfect example. Yesterday, there's an Amtrak derailment, right? And this terrible, terrible story over in Tacoma, Washington. Over the I-5, there's a bridge. The Amtrak derails right over the bridge and fell over. 6 people at least have been killed. 77 people were wounded, apparently. And it was a brand new track, right? The track was brand new. This was like its first run. And apparently there was an object on the track, and that's what derailed the train. Now, the real solution here, by the way, is to defund Amtrak, right? Amtrak is not a profitable thing. It's a waste of money. Literally, the only profitable part of Amtrak, I believe, is the Acela corridor. But put that aside, President Trump's first reaction here should not have been to go to policy, right? We didn't like it when Obama did it. But here's what Trump tweeted out nonetheless, right? Or here's what Trump said nonetheless. He said that we have to fix infrastructure because of Amtrak.
Let me begin by expressing our deepest sympathies and most heartfelt prayers for the victims of the train derailment in Washington state. We are closely monitoring the situation and coordinating with local authorities. It is all the more reason why we must start immediately fixing the infrastructure of the United States.
Right, that's bad, Trump, because the idea that he has to jump immediately to policy poisons the well. Right, this is a time when Americans should be responding to the tragedy, not calling for infrastructure fixes. And it turns out we don't need an infrastructure fix. We literally just built that rail 5 seconds ago. And this has been the pattern for Trump. Right, for every Justice Gorsuch, there's a Charlottesville. For every tax bill, there is a Mike Flynn and Steve Bannon. Right, this is the problem for Trump. The generalized impression of Trump over the first year is what's damaging Republicans, not his policies. Now, what Democrats are going to try and do is conflate his policies with this generalized impression of failure. They're going to say that he's unpopular because of the tax cuts, or because of Justice Gorsuch, or because he's cutting regulations. That is not true. He's unpopular despite those things. He's unpopular because President Trump says dumb things on a regular basis. And if he would stop saying dumb things on a regular basis, if somebody just unplugged his phone and he couldn't use Twitter for 2 weeks, his approval rating would go up by 10 points in 2 weeks. I promise you, he'd be up in the mid-40s immediately if he just shut up, right? Because if you look at the list of the big boo-boos that he's made, virtually all of them are rhetorical, right? Charlottesville being the most obvious example, when he went out there and said both sides were responsible, and then he suggested a moral equivalence between the people who were protesting at Charlottesville and the people who were actually the white supremacist instigators, and suggested that there were good people at Charlottesville. This is the problem for President Trump. If you look at the list of his failures, the Mike Flynn, the firing James Comey, the overall rhetoric, the fake news stuff, the LeVar Ball stuff, the fights with the NFL, right? All of that stuff is stuff that is stoppable. That's why we are so close to having a dream administration, really, but that's going to require President Trump to control himself. And I don't know that his base wants him to control himself. It seems to me that many in the base are more interested in Trump doing the NFL stuff than passing the tax cuts. They're more excited about the culture war aspect of Trump than they are about the policy side. I am precisely the opposite. Well, in a second, I want to discuss, back to good Trump, what Trump had to say about foreign policy, because Trump gave a big speech on the new national security strategy that he rolled out yesterday. And what's funny about Trump's national security strategy, what's really fascinating about this particular national security strategy, is something that is common to virtually all of Trump's speeches and all of Trump's rhetoric on foreign policy. Trump says one thing, and then he implements Bushian foreign policy. Now, let's be real about this. President Trump's foreign policy is very, very similar to George W. Bush's foreign policy. It's basically neoconservative in a lot of ways. During the campaign, there was every indicator he looked more like Rand Paul or Ron Paul than he did like George W. Bush. But in implementation, his foreign policy has looked a lot more like George W. Bush than like Rand or Ron Paul. The isolationist sentiments that he mouthed during the campaign have not materialized in real life. And so whenever you listen to one of his foreign policy speeches, what you actually see is a disconnect, right? Him kind of preaching the Ron Paul line or the Rand Paul line, and then when he actually talks policy, him embracing the idea of a powerful, muscular America in the world, making sure that our principles are upheld, and strengthening alliances through greater military firepower. I mean, that basically he's embraced Reagan-esque foreign policy while pretending to be a Pat Buchananite, which is a really interesting combo. Not particularly honest one, but it's interesting. So Trump gives his big national security strategy speech yesterday. He begins with what I think is a dubious premise. He talks about how the American people are the source of American greatness. You'll see why he does this in a second.
Throughout our history, the American people have always been the true source of American greatness. Our people have promoted our culture and promoted our values. Americans have fought and sacrificed on the battlefields all over the world. We have liberated captive nations, transformed former enemies into the best of friends, and lifted entire regions of the planet from poverty to prosperity. Because of our people, America has been among the greatest forces for peace and justice in the history of the world. The American people are generous. You are determined, you are brave, you are strong, and you are wise.
He finishes there by saying, when the American people speak, all of us should listen, and they spoke in November 2016, they love me, right? So I am the American people is basically the message here. The reason that Trump is doing this is because this is one of those disconnects, right? Trump doesn't want to say that the American creed is what makes us great. It is, okay? It's the American creed. It's not the American people. There is a distinction. The reason that I say this is because the idea that the American people make us great, well, that's like saying the Greek people make us great. What's different genetically about an American than about a Greek? Well, not much, because a Greek can become an American, right? What's genetically different between an Englishman and an American? The answer is not much, right? What makes America great is the central principles that we uphold. So far as the American people uphold those principles, that makes us great. But it's not the people themselves, right? It's not that we're better people than other people around the world. That's just silly. But the reason that he's saying that is because as soon as you start talking about greater principles that America holds, then you have to talk about how we promulgate those principles, and now we're back in neoconservative land, right? Now we're back in Bush-Reagan land. We're no longer in Pat Buchanan land. So again, this is one of these weird gaps in Trump's kind of thinking. And you'll see it here too. Here he talks about, and you'll hear the sort of Buchanan-esque note about isolationism. He talks about, in the past we've worried about nation building, but now we're bringing people home.
Our leaders engaged in nation building abroad while they failed to build up and replenish our nation at home. They undercut and shortchanged our men and women in uniform with inadequate resources, unstable funding, and unclear missions. They failed to insist that our often very wealthy allies pay their fair share for defense, putting a massive and unfair burden on the U.S. taxpayer and our great U.S. military. They neglected a nuclear menace in North Korea, made a disastrous, weak, and incomprehensibly bad deal with Iran, and allowed terrorists such as ISIS to gain control of vast parts of territory all across the Middle East.